Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The late afternoon sun pressed down on the Arizona Territory town, turning the wide street into a strip of hard-packed clay where every hoofprint and wagon rut lay baked in place. A rider came in slow from the North Trail, his horse thin with travel, but steady, its hide marked by dust and small welts from long days under the sun. The rider was a cowboy, not young and not old, carrying the kind of silence that made others glance twice before speaking. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, the brim of his hat drooped from rain that had dried stiff, and his revolver hung lower than most men wore theirs, as if weight alone kept it there. He had been gone for weeks, chasing a trail of outlaws who had broken into the freight depot and left 2 men dead. The sheriff's office had offered a small bounty for whoever was brought back alive, but the cowboy already knew he would not see much coin from it. What drove him wasn't the money. It was the memory of his younger brother, who had been shot down by a boy trying to prove himself to a gang. That kind of loss didn't fade, and when he rode out on jobs, it wasn't justice he carried so much as the need to keep the weight of doing nothing off his chest. As he dismounted at the livery, he felt the stiffness in his legs, the ache in his lower back from too many nights rolled in a blanket on hard ground. He led the horse to the trough, paid the stable hand without a word, and set the saddle down with care. Inside, he felt the same old tension. Towns were louder than the trail, and noise pressed against his nerves until he found a room alone. Still, he had no choice but to come back. A man could ride the country forever, but eventually he needed a roof, a meal, and a moment where he wasn't staring into the dark waiting for footsteps. The boarding house gave him that. He climbed the stairs with slow, careful steps, scanning the hall without thinking, the habit of a man who'd walked into too many places where a wrong face could be waiting. In the room, narrow and plain, he set his gear by the wall. He sat on the bed frame that creaked under his weight and exhaled for the first time since he'd entered town. His thoughts were restless. He'd done his job, followed the trail, returned alive. But he wondered, was he living or only surviving between hunts? Elsewhere, on the edge of town, a woman bent over a sewing machine that rattled with each push of her foot. Her name was known only in passing. Neighbors thought of her as the widow's seamstress. Years earlier, she had been married to a ranch hand who died during a cattle drive when a spooked steer pushed him into the river. The pay he'd left behind hadn't carried far, and she'd been forced into work that kept her close to survival, but never ahead of it. Sewing, mending, odd jobs, whatever put food on the table. The woman had lived like this for years, but lately the heat seemed sharper, the silence heavier. She often touched her collar as though it were choking her. Part of it was the desert's air, dry and punishing, but most of it was the grief that never quite loosened. Each stitch in the cloth reminded her of days when life had seemed larger than this small cabin, and every quiet evening felt like a reminder of what she had lost. Her main mission was simple: endure each day, feed herself, and not collapse under the pressure of debts and loneliness. His mission, unspoken, was to keep moving so that grief didn't bury him. 2 people who had no plans to meet, carrying different burdens that looked the same from a distance. That evening, paths crossed not in grand fashion, but in the stillness at the far end of the street where dust hung in the low light. The cowboy, weary but watchful, walked past her as she stood outside her cabin to breathe. She felt the fabric at her throat pulled too tight, the collar stiff and suffocating. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, failing to undo the button. She turned toward him, her voice low, almost ashamed of asking. "Could you?" She paused, her eyes lowered. "Could you unbutton this for me? I can't seem to breathe." The cowboy stopped. He didn't move right away. His thoughts ran quick. Was she testing him? Was this some kind of trick? Or was it just what it sounded like, a woman asking for help with something so small it cut right into the heart of human need? He studied her face, her fingers still pressed to the stubborn collar, and saw not games or guile but the raw, simple look of someone struggling. He reached out, steady, and slipped the button loose with careful fingers. Her chest rose with the first deep breath she'd taken all day. He pulled his hand back, gave a slow nod, and stepped aside without a word. In that instant, neither spoke of what it meant, but both carried the same thought. Survival was easier when someone else shared a piece of the weight. The cowboy left the boarding house early the next morning. The night had given him little rest. Sleep came in broken pieces, broken by the echo of gunfire that still lingered from the weeks he had spent chasing men who would rather shoot than surrender. He rose before dawn, washed quickly at the basin, and stepped out into a street that was still quiet except for a mule braying in the distance. His body was sore, his throat dry, but the weight on his chest was something different, an unease that came every time he returned to town. He knew too well that people asked questions, and questions led to stories he didn't want to tell. He walked toward the general store with his hat pulled low, not to hide, but to keep from being drawn into talk. He bought coffee grounds, a bar of soap, and a strip of jerky, all paid for with coins that barely covered the cost. The man at the counter tried to ask him about the ride south, about whether the outlaws had been caught, but the cowboy only answered with short phrases and moved on. He had no interest in recounting the trail, not to strangers who saw his work as entertainment. At the edge of town, the woman was already awake. The air was still heavy from the night, but she had set water to boil and begun sorting through a small stack of shirts and trousers left at her door. She took in mending from townsfolk who didn't have the time or skill to sew themselves. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes were tired. She had worked late the night before, patching a ranch hand's trousers by lamplight, and the effort left her with sore fingers and the same hollow feeling she carried most mornings. She pulled at her collar again out of habit, but this time the button gave easily, and she remembered the cowboy's steady hand from the evening before. It was such a small thing, yet the memory lingered. Questions rose in her mind. Why was a man like him still here? She had seen his type come and go. Cowboys rode through town often, most staying only as long as their pay or their thirst lasted. They brought dust, stories, and sometimes trouble. But this one had not gone to the saloon, had not bragged, had not sought company. She wondered if he had family somewhere, or if he too carried the silence of loss. She did not know his name, only that his presence had steadied her for a moment when she could not steady herself. By mid-morning, their paths crossed again. He was carrying a small sack of grain toward the livery when one of her spools of thread rolled down the porch step and onto the dirt. She stepped down to catch it, but he bent first, picked it up, and set it back on her table. "Yours," he said simply, his voice low, roughened by days without use. She gave a short nod. "Thank you." It was then that the cowboy asked about water. The boarding house basin was nearly dry, and he needed a clean pull. She told him her pump worked but stuck at the hinge. Without hesitation, he followed her along the narrow side path. He leaned his weight into the iron handle until it gave with a loud crack and then fell into a smooth rhythm. The bucket filled, clear and steady. He steadied it with one hand, and she noticed the tear in his shirt sleeve. Without thinking, she said, "Bring it by later. I'll fix that." That evening, he appeared at her door as promised, carrying the torn sleeve folded in. He did not step inside right away, waiting until she nodded. The cabin was small but clean, with a wooden table, a few folded shirts stacked neatly, and the faint smell of boiled soap. She threaded a needle, sat across from him, and worked in silence while he watched the lamplight play against her face. He thought of his brother then, of the nights they had sat by firelight, sharing food and talk that no longer existed. He did not say this aloud, but the memory pressed against him as heavily as the trail dust. She wondered why he sat so still. Most men could not last a minute in silence, yet he seemed to prefer it. She could feel questions building, the kind anyone might ask. Where was he from? Why was he alone? What did he want here? She asked none of them. Instead, she finished her stitches, tied the thread neatly, and slid the shirt back to him. "There," she said. He nodded once, took the shirt, and stood. Before leaving, he said something that surprised even himself. "You keep things neat." His voice carried no judgment, only observation. She met his eyes for a second, searching for the meaning, then gave a faint smile that looked like it hadn't been used in years. When he left, the street was quiet, the town preparing to settle into another night. She watched him go, A man with no clear home, no easy words, yet a steadiness she felt in her chest. Alone in her cabin, she wondered if this was the beginning of something, or if he would ride out at dawn and disappear like all the rest. For now, both carried unspoken questions. He wondered if this woman's quiet strength was something he could stand near without breaking. She wondered if this cowboy's silence meant distance, or if it was the same kind of silence she lived with each day. Neither of them knew the answers, but both knew they would meet again. The following evening, the town slowed under a red sky, the heat of the day finally loosening as the lanterns along the street flickered to life. The cowboy had spent the afternoon repairing tack at the livery, keeping his hands busy so his thoughts would not wander back to the things he could not change. He had thought of leaving again, heading south where there was work with cattle or north where the army still needed scouts. But the idea of walking out with no reason to return felt heavier than it once had. He had carried silence for so long that even the small exchange of words with the widow's seamstress had felt unusual, almost necessary. The woman, meanwhile, was finishing her day's work. She had spent hours bent over her sewing machine, mending a miner's torn shirt and patching a schoolboy's trousers. Her back ached, her eyes strained, but the memory of the cowboy sitting in her cabin the night before lingered in her mind. He had not tried to fill the silence. He had not asked questions. He had not judged her for living with little. That steadiness made her wonder who he was beneath the trail dust. She realized the townsfolk would ask these questions too. Where did this cowboy come from? What did he want in a town where no man stayed long? Was he dangerous, or was he simply tired of wandering? When she stepped outside for air, she saw him across the road, his posture straight, but his movements careful, as if he was never fully at rest. She hesitated, then walked toward him, her collar, buttoned too tightly in her habit of appearing proper, pressed against her throat again. She raised a hand, uncertain if she should speak. Before she could lose her nerve, she said quietly, "Would you?" Her voice faltered. "Would you undo this button for me again? The heat makes it worse." The cowboy stopped and studied her for a moment. His thoughts moved quickly. Was she asking out of trust, or was it a sign of weakness she did not want others to see? He knew the town well enough to understand how quickly small things turned into gossip. But her face was steady, her eyes honest. He stepped closer, lifted his hand, and with the same careful touch as before, freed the button. Her breath came easier, and she looked away, embarrassed at how much the small act mattered. This time, though, he spoke. "You don't need to wear it so tight. No one's watching you that close." His voice was even, not unkind. She gave a faint smile, but there was weight in her answer. "People watch more than you think. They see a widow who lives alone, who earns by sewing. They measure every step I take." Her words explained what had gone unspoken in the first chapter, why she clung to small gestures of dignity, why her collar stayed stiff even in the heat. It was not vanity, but survival in a town that judged harshly. The cowboy understood. He had lived with judgment too. Men calling him reckless for chasing outlaws, or cold for never speaking of his brother's death. He didn't say these things aloud, but he nodded once, enough to show he had heard her. They walked together toward her cabin, neither saying much. She invited him to step inside for water. The pump he had fixed still groaned, but it worked better than before. He filled a cup, drank slowly, and set it down on the table she kept clean despite the worn wood. The cabin was plain, but there was order in it. Folded cloth, a few jars of dried beans, a shelf with thread lined by color. He noticed the absence too. No pictures on the wall, no keepsakes beyond the sewing machine. It was a home stripped down to survival. She asked him a question then, one that had been hanging since the night they met. "Do you plan to stay here long?" Her tone was cautious, not prying. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He thought of his brother, of the empty trail that stretched behind him, of the bounties that kept him alive but never at peace. He wanted to say he didn't know, but the words came out differently. "I've been gone a long time. I'm tired of riding after men who don't matter once they're gone." It was the closest he had come to explaining his purpose. She nodded, as if that answer was enough. In truth, it filled a missing piece for her and for anyone listening. Why this cowboy, scarred and weary, had walked into this town with no hurry to leave. As the evening deepened, they shared a quiet meal she had set aside: beans, bread, and a small piece of dried meat. He accepted it without comment, but when he finished, he stood and said, "I'll bring firewood tomorrow. The nights will cool soon." It was not an offer. It was a decision made in his calm, certain way. When he left, she stood at the door watching his figure fade into the dark street. For the first time in years, she did not feel entirely alone at the edge of town. He walked back to the boarding house with a new thought pressing in his chest. Maybe, for once, staying could be more than just resting between hunts. The next morning came slow, the kind of morning where the sun seemed to drag itself over the ridgeline, leaving the air heavy before the day even started. The cowboy had not slept well again. He woke early, shaved quickly with a dull blade, and sat at the edge of his bed staring at the floorboards. His mind wandered through the same questions he had carried for years. What good had come from all the miles he had ridden, all the men he had tracked, all the nights he had spent alone? His brother was still gone. The bounty work paid less each time, and the silence of a room never changed no matter where he laid his hat. By mid-morning, he was at the store again, this time carrying a sack of grain toward the livery. The weight on his shoulder was nothing compared to what pressed in his chest, but keeping his hands full gave him reason to stay moving. As he walked, he noticed her standing outside her cabin, her hands busy sorting spools of thread into neat rows. One of them slipped from her grasp, bounced off the porch step, and rolled into the dust. She bent to catch it, but before she could, he stepped forward, picked it up, and set it back on her table. He didn't smile, didn't say much, just placed it there with the same care he showed his own belongings. This moment brought up something the townsfolk had been wondering, and perhaps the reader too. Why hadn't anyone else helped her before? Why had she been left to mend clothes alone, fetch water alone, and fight against the town's quiet judgment alone? The truth was simple. In a town this small, most people were too busy with their own troubles to notice someone else's. The ranch hands saw her as a widow who had chosen to survive without remarrying, and the women saw her as someone who lived on the margins. Help rarely came unless she paid for it. That was why the small things, the button, the water pump, the thread, mattered more than they seemed. The cowboy asked her if the pump was working, mentioning the boarding house well had run dry. She told him hers still worked, but the handle stuck. He followed her around the side path without hesitation. His hands gripped the iron lever, his shoulder leaning in until it groaned loose and began to move smooth. The bucket filled quickly, the sound of water splashing against tin sharp in the silence. He steadied it with the back of his hand before she could, a small gesture that drew her eyes for a moment. She noticed then the rip at his elbow. "Bring that by later," she said quietly. "I can fix it." That evening he came, shirt folded in his hand. He paused at her door, waiting until she gave the smallest nod before stepping inside. Her cabin looked different in lamplight. The neat stacks of cloth, the thread laid out by color, the oil lamp casting warm glow against plain walls. It was modest, yet cared for. She sat at the table, threaded her needle, and began to mend the sleeve. He sat across from her, the silence between them holding steady. This was where new questions might rise for the audience. Why didn't he go to the saloon like other men? Why did he choose to sit in silence with her instead of looking for company elsewhere? The answer lay in his exhaustion with noise. The saloon meant drink, cards, men eager to prove themselves. He had seen enough of that life, enough gunfights sparked by nothing. Here, in the plain cabin of a woman with no reason to lie to him, he found something that felt safer than whiskey and cards. As she sewed, her thoughts drifted. She wondered if he had family, if someone waited for him elsewhere, or if he too lived with the same emptiness that shadowed her evenings. The stitches came smooth under her fingers, but the silence between them was filled with questions she dared not ask. He, for his part, thought of his brother again. How many times he had watched him patch shirts by firelight when their mother had grown too tired. He felt that same mix of grief and steadiness now, watching her mend what was broken without complaint. When she finished, she folded the shirt and slid it back across the table. "It's stronger than before," she said simply. He nodded, stood, and after a pause, said something unexpected. "You keep things neat. That matters." His voice carried weight, not flattery, but recognition of the discipline that kept her life from falling apart. She met his eyes briefly, her lips parting into a faint smile that carried no polish, only truth. It had been years since anyone had said something that acknowledged her effort, not just her existence. He left into the night, the street quiet except for the creak of his boots. She stood in the doorway longer than she meant to, watching until his shape faded. Inside her chest was a feeling she hadn't carried in a long time, uncertainty mixed with something steadier than hope. For him, the walk back to the boarding house felt different too. The silence still clung, but it no longer felt as empty. Both understood nothing had been promised, but both felt in their own ways that something had shifted. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but one that carried a strange kind of steadiness. The cowboy found himself drifting more often toward the edge of town where her cabin stood. At first, it was under the excuse of small errands, hauling a sack of grain, checking the pump handle, carrying wood to her porch. But soon enough, it was simply because the silence there did not press on him the way it did elsewhere. For the woman, his presence was not a disruption, but a quiet addition, something she did not admit aloud but felt in the calm that lingered after he left. That week, she asked if he could help mend the back fence behind her cabin. The post had shifted, the wires sagged, and the goats from a neighboring homestead had already broken through once. She had meant to fix it herself, but lacked the strength to dig new holes. He agreed without hesitation, and the two of them worked side by side under the afternoon sun. He set his weight into the post-hole digger, driving it into the packed dirt, while she steadied the wood and held the wire taut when he pulled it through. They spoke little, but the work itself carried more meaning than words could. Here, the audience might wonder, why would a cowboy, used to chasing men and earning coin from bounties, choose to spend his time repairing fences and hauling water? The answer lay in what he felt each time he stood at her side. The work was simple, honest, and did not demand blood or gunfire. It reminded him of the life he might have had if his brother had lived, if the trail of outlaws had not become his only direction. For her, the question might be, why trust him so quickly when she had spent years keeping her distance from others? The truth was in his restraint. He had never pressed her for company, never stepped inside without permission, never asked questions she did not want to answer. That caution felt like respect, and respect was rare enough to feel like a gift. When the fence stood firm again, she brought out 2 cups of coffee brewed strong and bitter. They sat on the back step, sweat drying under the evening wind. He sipped slow, watching the horizon where the sun dipped behind low ridges. She looked at her hands, callous from sewing and work, and spoke first. "My husband used to sit here when he came in from the drive. He'd drink his coffee, talk about the cattle, the men, the money owed. I haven't shared this step with anyone since." The cowboy listened, his eyes fixed on the land stretching out before them. He thought of his brother, how they had once planned to start a small herd of their own. His brother had been the one who believed in roots, in building something that lasted. That dream had died in the dust with him, leaving the cowboy to carry a gun instead of plow. He swallowed hard before answering. "My brother. He died because of a boy too young to hold a pistol. Since then, I've been riding, hunting men who looked a lot like him. I thought it would give me peace. It never did." His voice was flat, but the weight in it was clear. Her eyes softened. She understood loss in a way few did. For years, she had carried her grief alone, but hearing his words drew a line between them. 2 lives shaped by death, both still searching for a reason to keep moving forward. She did not tell him he should stop chasing outlaws, did not offer comfort he had not asked for. Instead, she poured another cup of coffee and set it in his hand. That act, simple as it was, held more than words could manage. By the next morning, others in town began to notice. A ranch hand passing by saw him stacking firewood at her porch. The widow down the road spotted him carrying water buckets with her. Questions spread quickly in a town this small. Was the cowboy courting her? Was she letting him stay nights? Was this proper for a widow? These were the murmurs that often turned into sharp judgment, and she knew it. She had lived with whispers before, But the difference now was that she did not lower her eyes when she walked past them. For the cowboy, the whispers meant little. He had never lived his life by the town's approval. Still, he understood what it could mean for her reputation, and one evening he asked, "Do you want me to keep away?" People talk. She looked at him steadily, the lamplight drawing shadows across her face. "Let them," she said. "They don't carry my days." "I do." He nodded, but inside he felt a pull he had not expected. For the first time since his brother's death, he wondered what it would be like to stop running and let himself belong somewhere. That thought scared him because belonging meant risk. If he stayed, he could lose again. But as he watched her fold the last shirt of the night, neat and precise, he realized he was already making his decision without words. When he left that evening, she stood in the doorway watching him fade into the dark. She no longer asked herself if he would leave in the morning. She knew now the question had shifted to when he would choose to stay. The week turned harsh with news that spread from the South Ranch like a dust storm. The ranch foreman rode into town with a ledger tucked under his arm and a line of riders behind him. By midday, he stood in the street reading names aloud, debts owed for fence wire, salt blocks, and feed. Men shifted uncomfortably as he spoke, some ready to argue, others resigned. In towns like this, debts were weapons sharper than knives. The woman stood outside her cabin when she heard her name called. The foreman walked over with the ledger open, his voice cold and businesslike. "$2.60 owed by your late husband to the ranch store," he said. "Payment never cleared. That machine you use belonged to him, and by rights it belongs to the ranch now." She froze, her eyes narrowing. The sewing machine was her lifeline. Without it, there was no income, no way to trade her work for food. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her voice held steady. "That debt was paid in full. I worked it off with shirts and trousers for 3 months. I have the receipts." She pointed toward her cabin, where the folded papers were tucked under the drawer. The foreman smirked. "Receipts fade. Ledger don't." He snapped the book shut and reached as if the matter was settled. The neighbors who had gathered shifted uncomfortably, and whispers spread. People wondered the same things the reader might. How had she managed alone this long? What would become of her if she lost the machine? And why hadn't anyone stepped in before? Before the foreman could step onto the porch, the cowboy moved from the edge of the crowd. He placed himself between the man and the doorway, his stance calm but unyielding. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Open the ledger again." The foreman frowned. "This isn't your concern." The cowboy's gaze held steady, the kind that made men hesitate before drawing steel. She said she paid. "Let's see the mark." There was a long silence. The cowboy's heart beat heavy in his chest, but his face showed no sign of it. He knew that standing against a ranch foreman in front of townsfolk could make enemies. Still, he thought of his brother. How often he had kept quiet in the face of men who used power like a weapon. Not this time. The foreman hesitated, then flipped the ledger open again, dragging his finger down the page. There it was, a mark out beside her husband's name, faint but clear enough. "Paid in full." The foreman's face tightened, but he said nothing. He closed the book with a snap, turned, and walked back toward his horse, muttering about wasted time. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some nodded to the woman, others avoided her eyes. She stood frozen on the porch, her chest rising fast, relief mixing with anger. She wanted to thank him, but for a long moment no words came. Finally, she managed, "If you hadn't been here." He cut her off, shaking his head. "You shouldn't have had to fight that alone." Inside, she felt the old fear that had kept her awake many nights. The fear of being cornered, of having no one to stand beside her when men with power decided to take what little she had. That fear had shaped her silence, her careful steps, her stiff collar. And now, for the first time in years, it had lifted. Later, as the evening settled, she boiled a pot of beans and bread and set it on the table. He joined her without question. The lamplight flickered across his face as he ate in silence, his eyes tired but calm. She studied him and thought of the questions she hadn't dared to ask yet. Why had he really come back to town? Did he plan to stay? Or was this only a pause before the next trail? As if sensing her thoughts, he set down his cup. "I've chased men long enough. The work doesn't end. You catch one, there's another right behind him. I don't know if I'll ride again. Maybe I'm done with it. His words came slow, not as a promise, but as a truth he was beginning to accept. She listened closely, her hands folded on the table. Then what will you do? She asked. He met her eyes for the first time that evening. Maybe I'll take steady work. Fence mending. Well, digging. Something that lasts. Her chest tightened at his answer. For years, she had imagined her life as nothing but holding on. Yet in that moment, she saw the shape of something different. A man who might choose to stay, not out of pity, not out of passing need, but because the silence they shared gave him the same relief it gave her. When he left that night, the town was quiet. She stood at the doorway longer than usual, her hands resting on the frame. The machine was safe, the ledger settled. And for the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to wonder what it might mean if the cowboy truly stayed. The days after the confrontation with the foreman moved slower, yet something in the town had shifted. Word spread quickly of how the cowboy had stood firm, how he had forced the ledger open and sent the foreman off with nothing gained. Some men admired it quietly, others called it foolish to cross the ranch, but all of them knew his silence carried weight now. For the woman, the relief of keeping her sewing machine was only part of change. The bigger change was knowing that when she had been pressed hardest, she had not been left to stand alone. The cowboy began spending more time at her cabin. It wasn't planned, nor did they speak of it. His saddle started appearing near her porch when storms rolled in, and she stopped locking the door latch in the early evening, a small allowance that said more than words could. He cut wood at night, when he couldn't sleep, stacking it neatly by the wall so she would have enough for the week. She brewed coffee and placed a cup in his hand without needing to ask if he wanted it. Their days fell into a rhythm that outsiders might not notice, but both of them felt it as something steady, something necessary. Here, an audience might wonder, how did the town view her now? How did the whispers affect her, a widow who had lived by silence for years? The truth was, the whispers never stopped. Some said she was risking her dignity. Others claimed the cowboy was only resting until his next ride. But for the first time, she did not lower her eyes when she walked past them. The weight of judgment no longer mattered as much because she had found something firmer to lean on. One Tuesday, a fire broke out on the West Ridge. The dry grass caught quick, and by the time word reached town, men were already running with wet sacks and shovels. The cowboy joined them without hesitation. He fought alongside two ranch hands until his arms ached, beating back the flames that licked across the ridge until only smoke and ash remained. By the time he returned near midnight, his hair was damp with sweat and soot clung to his skin. She had been waiting, a basin of water already drawn, a clean shirt folded on the table. He said nothing as she dipped the cloth, wrung it out, and wiped the ash from his neck and face in slow, careful strokes. His eyes closed as the cool water touched his skin. It wasn't comfort he expected, but it was the first time in years he had allowed someone else to carry even a piece of his weight. She noticed his hands trembling slightly as he sat still, not from fear, but from exhaustion that ran deeper than muscle. That night, he didn't return to the boarding house. She offered him a chair by the hearth, and he accepted with a short nod. She spread a blanket across the seat, and while she settled in her bed, he sat awake for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the crack of cooling wood, the rustle of fabric as she shifted under the quilt. He realized then what had been left unspoken since their first meeting. He was no longer restless to leave. The thought of the trail, of bounty work, of endless nights under open sky, felt empty compared to this room where someone else's presence filled the silence. The next morning, he rose early and stepped outside. The air was cool, the sun not yet high. He found himself scanning the horizon not for threats, but with a sense of peace he had not known in years. Inside, she set 2 cups on the table instead of one, as if it were natural now to expect him there. For the audience, another question lingered. What did this bond mean for the future? Was it a passing comfort or something that could last? Both of them carried grief, both carried years of silence, and neither had spoken promises. But their actions, stacked wood, mended sleeves, water drawn, a basin waiting at midnight, spoke more than vows. When he sat down with the coffee steaming in front of him, she looked across the table and said quietly, "You don't have to go back to chasing men. Not anymore." He studied her face, then the cup in his hand. For the first time, he believed it was true. By late summer, the town grew restless with the sound of wagon wheels and shouting voices as a traveling auction rolled in. Traders set up along the street, unloading crates of enamel pots, bent pans, worn saddles, and a pair of horses that looked more stubborn than useful. The air was filled with dust and excitement, the kind that made men spend coin they didn't have. The cowboy stood at the edge of the crowd, hands resting at his sides, watching with the calm distance of a man who had learned not to want what glittered in the noise. The woman had walked down to the street as well, curious but cautious. She rarely bought anything. Her money was saved for flour, beans, and lamp oil. But she walked among the crates, eyes lingering on things she could never afford but still studied with quiet thought. The cowboy noticed her pause near a stout oak trunk with a brass lock plate. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, clean inside, and large enough to hold the folded cloth and thread she kept stacked in small boxes back at the cabin. She didn't touch it, only looked once and moved on, knowing better than to waste time with something out of reach. Without a word, the cowboy stepped forward. He waited until the bidding slowed, lifted his hand, and spoke one number. The crowd shifted, a few heads turning, but no one outbid him. The trunk was carried to the edge of the street and left there. He lifted it himself and carried it all the way to her porch. She stood at the doorway, unsure whether to speak, until he set it down just inside and stepped back. "You'll keep your work safe in this," he said simply. His tone was matter of fact, not grand, as though buying a trunk was no different from fetching water. Her hand lingered on the smooth oak lid as she opened it. Inside was the faint smell of cedar. She placed her thread and needles inside one by one, arranging them with a care that showed how much it meant. When she finally looked up, her eyes carried something unspoken, gratitude, but also recognition that he was beginning to make choices that tied him to her home. Here, an audience might wonder, why did he do this? A man who once lived by coin earned with a gun? Why give her something that anchored her work instead of keeping his money for himself? The answer lay in what he had begun to understand. Her survival was no longer just hers. If she worked with ease, if she kept her machines safe, if she rested without fear, then he too felt steadier. Her life was becoming part of his, though neither of them had spoken it aloud. That night, the rain came hard and sudden, pounding against the roof. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp earth and boiled beans. They sat at the table, the trunk closed beside the wall, listening to the storm. For the first time, he spoke about the trail with finality. "I'm done with bounty work," he said. "There's no end to it. Every outlaw caught, there's another waiting. I've given enough of myself to that life." He leaned back, his voice steady. "I'll take the north pasture job. Fence lines while digging. Pays little, but it comes regular." She looked at him closely. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," he answered. "I've been carrying ghosts long enough. They don't feed me, and they don't keep me alive." His eyes stayed on hers as he spoke, as though he needed her to understand it wasn't a passing thought, but a decision made deep inside him. For her, the words cut through years of wondering whether anyone would ever choose her world. The small cabin, the sewing machine, the daily grind of survival, over the road, and the freedom it promised. She didn't tell him she had prayed for someone to stay. She didn't tell him how many nights she had wished for footsteps that never came. Instead, she said quietly, "If you stay, I'll sleep without listening for the door latch." The storm eased, the rain softening against the roof. They ate their meal in silence, but it was a silence filled with understanding. Both of them knew what had been left unsaid in the first chapter. The cowboy's reason for staying, the widow's fear of being left again, was now answered, not with promises, but with decisions. When the lamp was turned low that night, he spread his blanket on the floor near the hearth. She didn't argue. The cabin was no longer just hers, and for the first time, the thought of sharing it didn't feel like a risk. It felt like the beginning of something that might last. The weeks after the storm brought a different kind of order, the kind that neither of them had dared to imagine before. The cowboy started each morning at the north pasture, signing his name in the ranch book and working the fence lines until dusk. He dug wells, hauled stone, and learned to accept the steady rhythm of wages handed out every Saturday, small but enough. For a man who had once lived by coin from bounty posters and the uncertainty of the trail, there was an unfamiliar weight in the regularity of it. Yet he found it calming. The woman's days shifted too. With the sewing machine safe and the trunk to keep her work organized, she began taking on larger orders. The school teacher brought her uniforms for the children. A miner's wife ordered curtains to cut the harsh light of the western sun, and even the widow down the road asked her for dresses. For years, she had been seen only as the quiet seamstress who kept to herself, but now she was part of the town's daily business. Here, the audience might have wondered from the first chapters what future could possibly exist for them. Could a man tied to the trail and a woman bound by loss find a place together in a town that judged every step? Chapter 9 begins to answer it. With each passing week, they no longer lived on the edge of town as outliers, but as two people slowly, deliberately shaping a shared life. On Sundays, when work was light, they walked into town together. She carried her basket with folded shirts. He walked beside her with his shoulders straight, and though whispers still followed them, they were different now. Some wondered if the cowboy meant to marry her. Others muttered about impropriety, but most had grown accustomed to the sight. For her, walking beside him was no longer about dignity. It was about truth. She was no longer alone, and that was something she had never thought she would say again. One evening, near the end of summer, he returned from work later than usual. His steps were heavy, his shirt damp with sweat, but in his pocket he carried something he had been shaping for weeks. At the table, after supper, he pulled it out and set it between them. A small tin ring, filed smooth, plain but strong. He cleared his throat, a rare unease flickering in his expression. "I want to be here at the end of each day," he said slowly, "and at the start of the next. I don't have more than this to offer, but I mean it." She looked at the ring for a long moment, her fingers brushing the metal. It was not gold, not polished, not something that would impress a neighbor, but it was steady, like the man who had placed it before her. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and she gave the smallest nod. "Yes," she said. The word did not come out with excitement or tears, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had already made her decision in her heart long before. For the cowboy, the tension in his chest eased, though fear still lingered under it. The fear of loss, of promises broken by death or circumstance. But for the first time since his brother's death, he felt the possibility of a future that was not shadowed by grief. That night, when he left her cabin to fetch his saddle from the boarding house, the air was cool, the horizon painted with the faint glow of a fading day. He realized he was not planning his next ride, not thinking of trails or maps or bounties. He was thinking of her, of the cabin, of the way the ring looked against her fingers. For her, lying in bed that night, the silence did not carry the same weight it once had. She did not wonder if he would leave by morning. The question had been answered. Both of them knew now. What had begun with a button undone in a moment of suffocation had become a choice to stay. The morning of the wedding came without fanfare, just as they both would have wanted it. The church stood at the center of town, small and weathered, its wooden spire leaning slightly from years of storms. Inside, the circuit preacher set out his book and spoke in a voice that carried more plain truth than ceremony. A few neighbors filled the benches. Women who had brought her mending for years, ranch hands who had shared a fence line with him, and the widow down the road who had once watched her with pity but now looked on with something closer to respect. The cowboy wore his cleanest shirt, the sleeve she had mended months before, and boots scrubbed free of trail dust. She wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, its seams neat, its collar loose enough for comfort. There were no flowers, no decorations, no music beyond the quiet creak of wood as people shifted in their seats. When the vows were spoken, they gave their words clearly and without hesitation. Both had lived too long with silence to waste words now. For those watching, questions that had lingered since the first chapters were answered in that moment. Would he stay? Would she trust him? Could two people so marked by loss choose something lasting? The answer stood in front of the preacher, steady and plain. They had chosen, and the town bore witness. Afterward, they walked together along the same road where she had once asked him to unbutton her collar. The street was quiet, the dust rising under their steps, the air warm but not heavy. She glanced at him once, her eyes catching the faintest trace of relief in his posture. He carried no saddle this time, no sign of departure. His place was decided. Back at the cabin, the changes were small but clear. The oak trunk sat under the window, filled with her sewing supplies. A shelf he had built now held 2 cups, not one. Firewood was stacked neatly outside, enough to carry them into winter. A pot simmered with beans and onions on the stove, filling the room with a familiar scent. These weren't grand signs of new beginnings, but steady markers of a shared life. That evening, they ate together at the table, the same table where he had first placed a shirt for mending, the same table where he had set down a plain tin ring. Their conversation was light, about the pasture, the price of flour, the order she still needed to finish for the schoolteacher. But underneath the ordinary talk was the knowledge that their years of solitude had ended. When night came, they barred the door and lowered the lamp. He set his gun belt aside, not by habit, but by choice, the first time in years he had laid it down without looking back over his shoulder. She folded the blanket across the chair, no longer needing it for a guest, and turned instead to the bed they would share. They lay side by side, the silence between them no longer empty but full of a quiet comfort. By morning, their life began the way it would continue, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady work. She drew water from the pump he had once fixed. He oiled the sewing machine, making sure the wheel turned smooth. Together, they checked the fence line, carried wood, and returned to the table for coffee. For anyone watching, it might have seemed an ordinary life. But for them, it was everything they had fought to reach. A home not built on fear, a bond not broken by silence, and a promise that staying could be stronger than leaving. The story had begun with her struggling to breathe, trapped by the weight of grief and the press of a button at her throat. It ended with both of them breathing freely, side by side, not asking what came next, because for the first time, they already knew. Their lives, once marked by loss, had finally found their place in the simple, steady act of staying.